to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with Andy Lipson and Kenny Zepeda. And today we will have the ongoing discussion on Venezuela and Nicaragua, as we had Kenny now for 2 times besides this time. This is the 3rd time.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And in light of what has been happening for the last episodes, we covered the Kurds and the USA pulling out, so to speak, and I put that in quotation marks for our listeners, and abandoning the Kurds essentially, and we will discuss what that U.S. relationship is, but in the context of Venezuela and Nicaragua.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of asked Kenny actually last week, in light of these conversations we've been having really since things went down in Nicaragua. We've been talking about the role of the United States. Can the movement on the ground trust the United States? Can they make a deal with them? And then Venezuela happened, and we talked about the role of the United States. Was that an uprising? Was it a coup? And in light of the role of the U.S. with relationship to the Kurds in northern Syria, I mean, obviously, I think both me and Eduardo were very clear. At least we felt there was a case study in why you cannot trust your movement to the U.S. empire, and that they will take it over and then abandon it at the first drop of a hat when they can. So
if it's of no interest.
Yeah. So that's I thought we might now revisit this stuff, the issues that came up around Nicaragua and Venezuela in light of that. So thanks for coming, Kenny.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get started then with, I think maybe you two have been having a conversation that I have not been privy to.
Well, I think the first thing was you had some thoughts about the episode that we just did last week, or maybe we were going to ask you maybe some of your thoughts about that, like anything that came up for you, that either myself or Eduardo said on that episode.
I mean, one of the questions that resonates with me is that question of whether you should make a deal with the U.S. You know, that was a question that came up when Nicaragua was in the thick of an uprising.
Mm-hmm. And when can you take us back to when that was?
April 2018.
Okay, so it's almost a year and a half.
Yes.
Okay.
And so a lot has transcurred in Nicaragua. The uprising has been quelled by force, by straight up fascism and militarization of the streets. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are in exile at this point, a lot of the leaders of the movement. And but I remember that at the time you asked the question, if we would be willing to make a deal with the U.S. You asked that, of Hema and me. At the time, my position was, I don't know.
Hema was our other guest and that showed up in 2 other episodes for our listeners.
Yeah, but since then, and since a lot of the events that have happened since then in other countries, like Ecuador, Puerto Rico, and now Syria.
Yeah, and
Venezuela, obviously. Yeah, and my position now is more firmly no. Obviously the Kurds are now being thrown under the bus. Mm-hmm. And left alone, to deal with the ramifications. And I mean, you can't trust the empire, mm-hmm. and that's my position now. And I don't know if you want to move on to Nicaragua.
Well, at that time, I'm curious.
Yes.
You did think that the USA should intervene?
No, I wasn't sure to what length. I wasn't. I couldn't see good things coming out of it.
For the USA to meddle in Nicaragua.
Meddle in Nicaragua because
politics,
because I didn't have any examples where the U.S. intervening is a good thing for anyone except for themselves. Mm-hmm. And even if it's a momentary calming of the waters, eventually they prove right now talked about last episode, they will throw you under the bus when it's convenient. Mm-hmm. And when it's when it serves their interests. And
right. Would you say that the events that as you've been reading this stuff, that when you see what the U.S. did with the Kurds, would you say that threw you from maybe being a little on the fence to now no? Or was it even before that you would come to that conclusion?
I would say even before that it was more of a confirmation of, the fact that I was thinking, I was even the Taliban. I was listening to this comedian, Argentinian comedian that talks politics, and he brought up the fact that the U.S. Hollywood propaganda system showed the Taliban as heroes in a Rambo movie.
Right. Rambo 3, I think it was. Yes.
He hugged the Taliban, called them the hope of the world, and then years later they're thrown under the bus. They're being persecuted,
right.
Because they're resisting empire.
And now the U.S. is looking to cut a deal with the Taliban.
Exactly,
again.
of
right.
course. After carpet bombing and increasing the violence, to pressure them to come to the table, but.
Right, and the ones they put up were the Northern Alliance, if you remember that. We're not talking about them any longer.
Yeah.
They're gone a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so just examples of how the U.S. will. It's empire building. You divide people or you exploit factions, and then you pick a winner and a loser.
Right.
And to some extent that's going on in Central America too. And it happened in the 80s with Reagan. When he gave Nicaraguans asylum, and that explains why in San Francisco we have a lot of Nicaraguan, in the mission, in the community that had access to social mobility, versus El Salvador that was completely destroyed, and they didn't want another Nicaragua happening in Central America. So the U.S. and this is a fact. This is not an opinion. There's there's documents that prove this, that they invested so much money in increasing the terror tactics in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, and now you have the issues that you have now in these countries. And so at the time they picked Nicaragua, also in the context of the Contra, Iran-Contra scandal, and you have what you have now. Central Americans from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador criminalized, and Nicaraguans in great part, they have a better avenue for social mobility in this country.
Right. Right. And I know that we're going to get more into whether or not the U.S. is really being sincere in trying to take down Ortega, and you have an opinion about that.
I have a strong opinion about that.
But I'm going to ask, at the time when we were discussing the potential U.S. role, the things that were being thrown around were things like sanctions, the U.S. Congress putting sanctions on certain individuals. Yeah. What would you say about that?
I mean, again, I've come to the side that thinks that sanctions don't help. I mean, look at Venezuela. One thing that doesn't get talked about in mainstream media is that these sanctions create a situation for the most vulnerable, where they're going hungry. They don't have access to medicine because the country doesn't have the ability to make payments. Just recently in Iran, there were many ships with grains stuck at the port. They couldn't make the transactions to get those goods because of the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on them. And we don't talk about these sanctions as acts of war, economic war, and how it handicaps the very people they claim to. The U.S. Claims to be wanting to help.
Right.
And I also. It's not even, to me, a situation where they're trying to force democracy by it's not even that. To me, it's about oil, period. It's about, the sanctions are not about even the people. It's about limiting the capacity of these countries, Iran, Venezuela, their capacity to produce at the fullest capacity. Sorry for the redundancy. But I think we talked about that in one of our talks a couple of weeks ago, where one big factor here is that the U.S. is the biggest producer of oil in the world. That happened last year. They're producing more than Saudi Arabia, so they're set up to dump this oil in the market and have control of the economy of the future. And so it's to their benefit to not allow Iran in Venezuela to produce,
right?
Because if they dump their full production in the market, the price of oil goes down.
While at the same time letting their allies, who might have, like Saudi Arabia, whether they bomb a Yemen into the Stone Ages or not, let them produce, because they know they'll be reliable in terms of turning the spigot on and turning the spigot off. Yeah.
And you said the sanctions, and the sanctions always affect the poor.
Yeah.
They don't affect the people who are in government. They don't
No.
affect the elite class in that country. It's the people who are most affected. You're sanctioning the peasants. You're sanctioning the working class.
Yeah.
So I think that may we say that the three of us agree that sanctions do not work.
Yeah, and I think Kenny, you even went further, and one of the aspects of modern warfare is that modern warfare now targets industry.
Yeah.
Now targets a country's ability to produce goods,
Mm-hmm.
and that I do think I agree with you, Kenny, that it's not that the sanctions unfortunately hurt people; they are targeted against a country's economy and industry, and they are trying to cripple that. And they are acts of war in the same way that when you drop bombs on cities and you pick particular production centers. That happened in Japan. That happened when the U.S. bombed Germany, and that's how the Axis powers went after Britain. Things like that. So it is modern warfare.
Mm-hmm. Why did you say Kenny went further? What do you mean? What do you reference into? Did you have something else besides sanctions that you thought was affecting other countries, that when the U.S. imposed the sanctions that?
I'm not sure I understand that.
Well, he was
you
saying it's not just a misguided thing, or it's not just it's not just attacking people. Like he's I thought you were connecting it directly to trying to cripple an economy, cripple an industry.
It's not an effort to create democracy from the bottom up.
Yeah.
It's not an effort to. Democracy is not a priority there. It's sanctions are an act of war again to cripple the economy. It's not to help people, make them desperate enough to overthrow their own government.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to then say, what would then you think Nicaragua or Venezuela needs to do? What is the following step if you were to be able?
I don't know. I mean, one thing so if we dive into Nicaragua, in retrospective, one of the failures, at least from my perspective as a leftist, is that the left in Nicaragua failed miserably at unmasking Ortega, because to me Ortega is not a socialist. I mean, he calls himself a socialist, but when you look at the foundations of the economy, the country, the reforms, Ortega is actually the guy that the U.S. wants there, because there is a lot of industries in Nicaragua that have a tight relationship with the U.S. Outsourcing of call centers. When you call and talk to Capital One, most likely you're talking to a Nicaraguan person, or the managers that handle those accounts are in Nicaragua. When you're calling Macy's, when you Equifax, the credit reporting union, you call in Nicaragua. Walmart is very much alive. PriceMart is a subsidiary of Costco, and you can still buy Kirkland products over there. And so the problem that happened in Nicaragua, they had a pact. The elite, the traditional elite, had a pact with Ortega. They had a lot of concessions. Like free taxes for 7 years.
And these are people connected, or either Sandinistas or connected to the Sandinistas, right?
Not just that. I mean, even just straight up capitalists that that would just speak whoever is in power.
Right.
And so they had a pact. They did have some sort of equilibrium, if you call that. And then when they saw that the people rose up and they wanted him out, they were just angry because there was a lot of unemployment, among the people that did not speak English, young people educated. So there were acts of repression going on in the background, but it wasn't up front, and they experienced that once millions of people started marching on the streets. They started experiencing the repression straight up, because Ortega was trying to hold on to power. Because he doesn't have a political base at the time. Now, most people want him out, but he's ruling the country by pure force. We have friends that are starting to travel back, and they tell you the country has changed. There is military in every fucking corner now. And so this is one of the things Lipson and I have talked about, with some of the readings we do. And to me, this is an example of a failed reformist movement giving an opening for fascism, because this guy lost power. He's just ruling by force. I mean, and so again, to me, Ortega is the guy the U.S. wants there. He's a dictator. but he's still having, a good relationship with American business.
But
So-
in history, he wasn't considered a dictator. He was considered to be revolutionary at one point.
Sure, I mean, you could argue that in the past. I mean, yeah, but I mean, when I look at the evidence now, it's more than obvious. Again, even the sanctions. If the U.S. wanted to sanction Nicaragua, that country would scream in 2 seconds. They don't have the capacity that Iran or Venezuela have because they don't have the resources these countries do. The natural resources, and so they have no interest in getting him out. This is their guy, and we know the U.S. and the capitalists love dictators. They don't have to deal with messy democracies.
Mm-hmm. I want to inform our listeners that Kenny lived in Nicaragua for some time.
For 2 years. I traveled for 8 years, at least a couple of times, and yeah.
But you're originally from Guatemala.
I'm from Guatemala, so I understood a little bit of the history of Central America with the U.S. and I'm just concerned because
I think it's worth maybe walking it a little bit back because there were, at the time of the uprising or the time of these demonstrations, there were debates within the left. There were debates here because some people were like those in the same things are kind of being talked about. Hong Kong. There are people who were saying that those marches, even if they might have started off good, that these things were ultimately playing into the U.S. hands, that these were ultimately people who were going to be ultimately helping the U.S. empire, and for that reason, there were people on the left who took the side of Ortega.
Yes.
And can you tell me what you would say were some of the sides on these questions? Like, that's just one that I'd known of. What are some of the other politics that you would say? Because I think you weren't part of that. How would you maybe, first of all, how would you characterize what I've said in terms of about some of those positions, and what would you have said are the other positions you're familiar with in terms of debates on the left?
Sure. I mean, I was concerned because even some of the people that I follow, that are very anti-empire in the American media, they were very quick to jump on that bandwagon of, this is, orchestrated from outside. And there was little attention. I think that was one of the things that Hema was concerned about, that we weren't giving enough credit to the people that were on the ground doing the work, and we were dismissing them as sort of fools, from the left, in the sense that they're just being played by these the outside powers, but they don't understand that and again, but I think that's important, that at the time we were not talking about Ortega being their guy. We were buying that thing that he was selling us, that he's a socialist, and that he opposes the U.S. Does he really?
Well, I think some of the people, and this was something that I was thinking of at the time, and now I think you've sort of shifted my mind on this, is that the U.S. was going to use these demonstrations, which they definitely, I did not feel like they initiated them, but I felt like they were starting to creep into them so they could use them as the basis for toppling Ortega. And at that point, then those movements are not doing any good because now they're under the essentially command of the United States. You don't see that that's what the dynamic at play.
No, and I mean, and look at the evidence. Ortega's still in power. If they wanted to topple him, there were 2 million people out of 6 million people on the streets. If they wanted to topple this guy, they could have, in some way, because people were, but this is their guy, and it's not just Ortega, obviously, it's the whole military machine that's, ruling the country now, that has something at stake there. That's the ruling class ruling Nicaragua.
Right. And one of the things you said is you made a comparison between how much they brought the hammer down in Venezuela compared to, even though they said that they were going to do sanctions, and even made some criticism of the U.S. made criticism of Ortega. You feel like they were making public criticism of Ortega, but behind the scenes you feel like they were supporting, ultimately making sure Ortega stayed in power.
Tacit support, they did it in
what would you say is your evidence, and what was the reason you would say that?
I mean, the many sanctions that Venezuela has had, if we use that as a comparison, Venezuela has been crippled to, in so many ways, to this day, a lot of people don't understand that, Venezuela is unable to buy medicine or food because they don't have access to the world financial markets. Their money has been...
Their assets have been frozen.
And... that's one of the biggest things to me. Or even that whole stunt with Guaido in trying to, impose this government from outside.
Yeah.
And
It's a failure.
It was a complete failure. It was,
Lost John Bolton his job.
Yeah. And where is Guaido now? Where is Venezuela in the news now?
Yeah.
Where
the
is
sanctions are still there.
Yeah, exactly. The sanctions are continue because again, they want to continue crippling that oil production.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even about the people.
Or even Maduro.
Even Maduro,
per se.
yeah. No, it's about the oil production to me. And I mean, and for a second, it seemed like maybe they would intervene, in some way. Militarily, yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think they're happy now. I mean, they're.
And part of what you were saying to me, and I agree with this. I'm starting to agree with this. Is the heavy hand they brought to Venezuela to really bring the hammer down, and the extremely light touch they seem, because they did apply some sanctions. In Nicaragua.
Some people are around the top, yeah.
Yeah, but they never, like you said, they never applied it directly to Ortega.
Yeah.
And they did a very light touch.
Yeah.
And it seems more like they might have made lip service, but ultimately, if they're supporting Ortega, then they're also supporting his attack on the movement.
Yeah.
They're basically, at least tacitly, without saying they're supporting, they are basically saying, well, you've got to have to crack down.
I mean, even Venezuela is on the terrorist watch list. Nicaragua's not,
Mm-hmm.
And they're supposed to be, what is that name they gave to Cuba, Nicaragua, and the triad? Triad of Tyranny, yeah. But
Triad of Tyranny, then maybe.
Huh? Some name they gave, in order to sell the
very
whatever.
Catchy.
We have our producers in the back. What is it?
It's triad.
There we go.
So,
give us information. Where's the teleprompter?
Working on it.
So you said the Triad of Tyranny?
Tyranny.
I think so.
Are you sure?
Okay. And Nicaragua was part of that.
Yeah, and but again, businesses thrive. The people that most vulnerable are suffering in Nicaragua. The economy went down the drain. But I mean, the people that are working in these call centers that speak English, they're doing okay.
Mm-hmm. So would you go so far as to say, like, they're socialists here, and people like Camilla Mejia,
yes.
who would have said, those people are just dupes of the U.S. They're crippling opposition to the U.S. empire in Nicaragua by supporting these movements.
Yeah.
You're actually going to say that no, actually you're the one who's falling for the United States.
Yes.
Because you're the one. The United States is backing Ortega. Ultimately, the United States is keeping Ortega there because they're not showing any real effort, any real initiative to take him down. Yeah,
I mean, and to me, like at the time when they first came out, I was upset even though I hadn't figured out why. It just seemed that they used a broad brush, to say this is, just another U.S. intervention and, discrediting the people on the ground. And that, no doubt the movement lacked an identity, no doubt it lacked political identity to push further left, because that's what I thought. And at the moment I said in private to some people that if anything, people should be pushing further left, because this guy is not the left. Mm-hmm. He's very much the right. He's just, is wearing, sheep's clothing or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so that's what he has failed by and large. And, they jumped in bed too with the local elites, the local oligarchs. The movement did, because the strikes that were somewhat supported with consent of the big business in Nicaragua. And they were momentary. The church also was there.
Yeah.
But I mean, those businesses are still functioning, But a lot of people have lost their jobs, and so the strikes weren't meant to cripple, the ruling class, which ultimately was choosing whoever was going to be in power. Because this is my reading of what happened in Nicaragua, that as soon as the elites and oligarchs in the country saw that Ortega wasn't his way out, they jumped ship. And that's where the pact that we talked about earlier was broken. And so then, Ortega tried to punish a lot of these oligarchs and, people with, by having people invade their lands and this and that, and targeted, attacks. And so, yeah, I mean, and that was the case with the U.S. If anything, the U.S. was waiting to see, is our guy going to fall?
Right.
If he's going to fall, of course they were jumping, try to have a hand at who comes next.
But they weren't flooding in there to make
No,
sure.
hell no, they were not. They were, and I mean, yeah, and it was working. It was work. It is still working for outside businesses. I'm wearing a jacket that was what's it? The North Face jacket assembled in Nicaragua. By the way, I just looked at it today. You know, and Under Armour and all these things. A lot of sweatshops function down there.
Kenny, you didn't say last time, but you're anti-capitalist, are you?
Yes. I am, I think, more of a revolutionary, not a reformist, because I'm starting to understand more. You know that, and again, to me, Nicaragua is that example of a failed reformist movement that where people rest at just reforms and not pushing for the end goal, which is socialism, a socialist world and society. And it also points out to the difficulties of building socialism from the top down, because that's what Ortega represents.
Would you say that Nicaragua is something that shifted for you inside? How would you describe, or how would you say that what was the marker for what was to inspire you to start looking into
sure,
revolutionary
yes,
in the sense of socialism?
Yes,
no?
it's definitely a learning experience. I most definitely was not underground. I was very much in touch with people on the ground. Our friends were risking their lives, because they wanted him out. They didn't have the, socialist identity that I do, or capitalist. They just wanted people to not get messed with. People were getting shot on the neck, the chest. People were being tortured, taken away to hold on to power. And it's a learning experience, because I see the failures. I see also the power of people. The power of people uprising and figuring it out, together, because they care about each other. People fighting on the trenches, and I personally see a world where that's going to happen to us. It's just, where people are going to have to rise up they are doing it already in many places. It's a matter of what shape, what ideas, guide that energy, because it doesn't have to end in socialism. It can end in pure fascism, or sectarian violence, where we kill each other because we're black, we're white. If we don't understand what is under, at the root of all these ideas, of power and capitalism, and how capitalism shapes this world.
And I think you had said earlier that if that movement doesn't fight for revolutionary socialism, for international working class control of everything, and getting rid of capitalism, not just one politician or two politicians, then that reform movement will ultimately, if you don't make your goal that, then your reform movement that you think is trying to bring some nice thing along won't work, and you get fascism.
Yeah. I mean, we have some samples of that in the U.S., I think. We had a failed movement with our great hope Obama, where we wanted, to implant all these things. And in retrospective, we see the result now. The net result is it was more of the same shit. If anything, they just, put us to sleep, people on the left. And there's still people that want to hold on to that lie, even though the evidence is, concrete. I mean, we know now that Obama deported the most people, even more than Trump. Trump hasn't reached his numbers. You can go to the website of, the Customs and Border Enforcement and look at the numbers. Sure, they can manipulate it, but it's obvious. I mean, I've known stories in this country for 10 years ago where people were being put in the ice box, that we so much talked about, that people being held at gunpoint, people being abused, but people didn't want to challenge this when Obama was in office. And as we play this game of left and right, in the Republican or Democrat, we might have another Democrat in office, and so what? Are we going to stop questioning things because they're Democrat again? And then that to me is what opens the door to people like Trump. And this might be the beginning of something worse, because the counterweight in this country, the counterweight in the world, is non-existent. The counterweight is reformism, and there is evidence. Look at Obama. There's your evidence. It doesn't work.
Or Bernie Sanders even, or
or Cortez. They flip flop when it's convenient.
So would you describe your evolution as in the direction of socialism?
For sure, definitely. I mean, I'm not a utopian socialist. I don't think that it's going to be a perfect world. I am ultimately for worker power, for conquering political power, and and figuring it out. I'm not going to tell you. I don't want some asshole telling me. I want us to decide together. Empowering people, understanding these ideas. You having a say in it. And there is plenty of it. I was just talking to my aunt and my mother, and these are women that could be dismissed by someone, elitist person, because they don't speak the language, the verbiage of college, but they understand how the world works. In there's a lot of knowledge there, that in any movement you would need these people, like my mother. That have gone through this world, and they know, that their bosses are exploiting them. But we can dive into, the left in this country too, being elitist and dismissive.
Yeah. And even in the Russian Revolution, there were socialists who were dismissive of what are they talking about? These cooks, these cleaners of houses who are going to be running this country now. Like the same thing that would be leveled against the most. The people who are put down the most here, the red state fools, and the people in the Midwest and things like that. That happened in the Russian Revolution. The idea there were revolutionaries who or people who call themselves revolutionaries, socialists, who would spit at the idea of these lumpen people running society. They felt like the socialists had to kind of tell them how it could be run. We can do it for you, kind of thing. So there's been a tradition of that in what I would now call social democracy. The Bernie Sanders socialists, who say they're for the people, but ultimately they don't think the people can really run things.
Yeah.
I think a summary of what I'm hearing you say is that the socialists who thought they were fighting for socialism by making some sort of support, critical support of Ortega, were actually supporting U.S. empire.
Sure.
That's one criticism you make. And the other criticism is the movement on the ground, if there was the problem with it, is it wasn't really socialist enough.
Yeah.
Or it wasn't even socialist at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it wasn't going to be successful unless it was.
Yeah. One of the questions I have, the left, in the U.S. and just defending anyone and everyone that labels themselves socialists, or communists, like in Cuba, and overlooking, a lot of the warning signs or failures of these, people, and just because the U.S. is attacking them, and they claim themselves socialists, we have to defend them because they're socialists. So what I'm concerned about is, I think that the left, that I was listening to outside the U.S., the Nicaragua, in the U.S., was speaking the side of Ortega because they weren't looking hard enough, and it was just enough to claim that you're a socialist.
And but I do think, and this is what this, I would never go as far as Camilla Mejia going like, oh, that movement is a dupe, but I did think it was moving in that direction, right? But that's because I thought that the United States.
That's you.
Okay, sorry. That's because I thought that the United States really was going to use this movement to push Ortega out. And once you've convinced me that isn't really, that they were really actually more waiting, and ultimately were like, nah, we're not doing it. Even if they said they were doing it, and that's where had the U.S. gone in with soldiers. Yeah. Like they're doing it, like they were thinking of doing in Venezuela, then yes, and if Ortega is putting up not socialist opposition but capitalist opposition to U.S. military movers in that region, then he is only an ally only in the fight against imperialism.
Yeah, I mean at the time I remember thinking that this was going to be Trump's little war, successful war, because they would overrun that country in 2 seconds, if they dropped the U.S. machinery, on them. And yeah, I mean, the Nicaraguan government has some relationships with the Russians and China, but I mean, what could they do here in this continent? I mean, were they really going to intervene for a country that there is no other interest really than just having another ally, in bashing on the U.S. But even that, Ortega is pretty quiet about the U.S.
Right.
And I mean, obviously to mobilize his base, he talks shit about the U.S. It's popular, obviously, because I mean, even in Nicaragua, a lot of people are very cautious, very weary about the U.S. Even if they're not Orteguistas, people understand history, understand that the U.S. Has fucked up a lot of shit. And people outside the U.S. understand this actually.
Yes.
You go to Guatemala, you go to even people that are capitalists. They're like, I don't know if the U.S. But obviously the people that have interests at stake, the ruling classes, they are very much entangled with the U.S. Their kids are born in the U.S. for God's sake.
Can you tell us anything about the canal they planned?
Sure. I mean, that was another thing.
I think that was an interest, no?
I mean, it was an attempt. So it was a project with a Chinese company to build a canal to compete with the Panama Canal. It would be bigger to support bigger ships. The Nicaraguan government sold the rights of a section of the country for 50 years, I believe. It was also a very hush-hush contract that was rushed, and it was managed by the Ortega's son. And but this company also had a history.
Is his name Hunter?
Sure, Hunter. Hunter Ortega. Yeah. And the canal never materialized. There were a lot of funds, obviously lost, and but the company itself had a long history of not completing projects. And obviously, China is dropping money around the world. I mean, they want, they want to have allies. They are doing it, in Africa and many countries. And so, I don't know. To me, it seemed like it was another instance of the elites, the ruling classes, funneling money into their pockets.
Right.
And but it never. I mean, there was resistance of peasants whose lands were being taken away, and so these peasants were organized against Ortega.
Right.
And
ironically, I read this thing by a U.S. Think tank critical of China's investment operation that they have in place in Nicaragua and Africa, calling it a debt trap. Accusing China of trying to create debt traps for these countries. It's very. I mean, I'm sure that China's doing it, but I think the U.S. knows it because this is how the U.S. has built their empire. It's building debt traps throughout South America.
I mean, like a lot of the debts that the countries have, happen after they were trying to industrialize. I don't know if you're aware of. It was an industrialization substitution tactic that a lot of countries were trying to achieve. They were trying to replace their industries, so they wanted to stop depending on foreign industrial goods. But obviously, the U.S., the IMF, the World Bank said, we'll lend you money, but you have to do what we tell you.
Right.
And then that's where a lot of these countries became indebted to the U.S. banks.
And this is what the United States is concerned that China is now starting to do.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing with the canal, though, I think wasn't that a reason given for like either selling off or pushing out indigenous people from their lands?
I mean, that's what I meant by peasants, that there was resistance. It was kept, to the side. It wasn't really covered in the news in Nicaragua, obviously, because the news is owned by the Ortega family, most of them at least. It was happening, and a lot of people didn't realize this resistance was going on until the big movement happened. When peasants were very organized, because they had been fighting these capitalist powers for a while.
Right. And I think I'm sort of jumping around, but I think one of the things that could have given us a hint that the U.S. was going to take a very different role in Nicaragua than Venezuela is when there was that Guaido resistance and the Guaido uprising. It was like 24/7 media in the United States, right?
Yes.
But it actually was very difficult to get U.S. media reports from around what was going on in Nicaragua.
I mean, we're getting also a lot of reports from Hong Kong right now because they're fighting China, evil China.
Right.
But we don't see a lot of reports on Ecuador, for example,
Right.
where the IMF it created a fucking shit show. Puerto Rico, similar. Well, Puerto Rico's a little different. It's not the relationship to the IMF, but the relationship to the empire, the U.S. Austerity, is fucking their shit up.
Right.
Sorry, cousin, but
Or in Brazil.
or in Brazil, and El Salvador too, like last year, Honduras.
Right now with the corruption scandal.
Yeah.
With the president, with his brother having ties to narcos. So there's an uprising, but people aren't paying attention to it.
I mean, and that's another topic that maybe we can discuss in the future. But just the whole label of being linked to narco traffic. It's not like the U.S. doesn't know that the militaries of these countries are in deep, with the narco traffic.
Right.
They themselves run this shit, and
Yes.
they're
They
in
pick
cahoots.
sides.
Yeah, they're pick sides, and they're in cahoots with the U.S. and who knows how many politicians in this country.
Right.
And I mean, there is no intention of ending the war on drugs.
No, it's the reason for U.S. actually being able to militarize their relationships with these governments.
I mean, I was thinking today about the label ISIS when I was listening to your last episode, and how they dropped this blanket statement.
Yes.
You're ISIS, and this is the reason they can excuse atrocities or military presence. They do that thing in
MS-13.
Central America. MS-13. Well, they fight that indirectly, but I'm talking more. I concentrate more on the war against the drugs.
Drugs, okay.
Yeah, that they have a deep presence because of this excuse, and when in reality we know what the source of the violence is. Is American money, American weapons, American consumption. And so nothing is being done about that to decrease that violence that is happening down there. And yeah, I mean.
We had done an episode last week, and you had referenced it. What would you say is your position on the so-called pullout?
I mean, I'm not an expert. That's why I decided not to participate on that one.
We had asked Kenny to come, and he said, "Nah, no thanks."
Yeah, because I didn't feel comfortable enough. But I mean, reading, listening to things, understanding a little more of the actors, in there. It seems obvious. And again, this is me coming from a socialist frame, trying to understand empire and seeing the patterns that happen in other countries, and the tactics they use. And I'm like, they're, I have more questions than answers. And like, what is their intention? Anytime.
When you say they, when is the U.S.
The U.S.
intention? Yeah.
Anytime the U.S. does something, I ask what is really happening.
Yes.
It's never what you see in the news, because again, it's evident. If you're not convinced that the U.S. media jumps right behind the war machine, by now, like, just look at Venezuela. Like, and how everyone was on Venezuela's ass trying to get him out at the time when it was politically convenient. And now they're forgetting about the suffering Venezuelans, that they care so much about then.
Right.
It's yesterday's news.
Right, because they don't have a plan to get rid of him right now.
No.
When they do, you're going to hear about it in the news again.
Exactly, and that's how the media works. I mean, we get a cycle for a week, and
But not just that; it's operating like a political arm
Sure.
of the U.S. state.
Yeah.
To try to rally people behind it, to try to make facts on the ground, and of course to justify whatever the U.S. plans on doing. The U.S. would have gone in, but I think that I do think the empire has its fingers in too many pies.
Yeah.
And I do think that's what Trump is trying to do, is trying to extract some of those fingers from the pies, not so they can make peace in the world, but so that they can actually make war more effectively in the regions that they're more concerned about.
And I mean, they have, in a way, reached a very important strategic goal, which is oil independency. They are the biggest producers of oil. And I mean, in Venezuela, it's just down the road. So, if we have to go get more oil, maybe we'll go there.
Yeah. And
one of the questions I have that came about from your episode last time is that, should we support just anyone that opposes the U.S.?
Well-
You know, just because I think for me at the moment, that seems to be part of the left problem. That we defend people like I'm not a fan of Castro, for example. I understand that, you know, he was against the empire. He stood up. It's remarkable that he survived so many assassination attempts and all this stuff. But I'm not gonna overlook the shitty shit that has happened. And I understand the context of sanctions and this and that. But I mean,
Should we support? What do you mean by support? Do you mean like how do we? What do you mean by support?
well, like romanticize certain people and not question and not ask the tough questions just because they call themselves socialists and they have had some level of success. And I think that we have to be honest, because I hear a lot of resistance, obviously, on people that don't, they're only dive superficially into the subject of socialism. But I think some of those questions merit paying attention to. You know, that we have to be honest and unmask the things that are wrong. You know, and a lot of people glorify, and this might be your weekend socialists or, or reformists or whatever, but, really being honest with the mistakes of the past, in understanding where we're heading and how.
I personally think that we should not be intervening in other countries.
The United States, right?
Yeah. The USA. That the USA should not be intervening. That one. But I do not excuse whatever is going on. When I say that the USA should not be intervening, like what we said on some episodes past, that the USA should not be meddling in Venezuela, at the same time, I don't excuse whatever's happening in Venezuela, because I know that Maduro is not truly a socialist. I don't consider that country to be a socialist, nor do I consider Fidel Castro to be a socialist in the truest sense. I think that there's a lot of nepotism that exists because of his family that has so many ties that are in government. And when he retired, he had his brother in as a leader, and that is just transferring power to within your family, or the people that you want to put in place. And I do think that we sometimes romanticize, and that I do think sometimes people on the left, and I challenged someone when we had here on What's Left, we had another socialist, Natalie Risi, where she was talking about North Korea and wonderful things about North Korea, and I agree with some of the things that she had said, but at the same time we cannot excuse some of the things that North Korea has done, such as slave labor, and
restricting the movement of
restricting
their workers
and just that. So I think that there are people on the left that do defend other countries, and that irks me personally. Yeah.
Well, first off, I mean, it's not so much whether or not Raul Castro or who was the Fidel Castro, or even Maduro, whether they're socialists or not. It's that socialism doesn't exist in those countries because working class democracy doesn't exist in those countries. Workers don't.
I meant
decide.
to say that.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying we often, and we have the same problem in our union. We talk about our union. When we talk about our leadership, we say the union, like our president and our vice president, and the union is our members, right? Yeah. And so I think socialists, because socialists have for a long time equated who controls the state with, and if you're a socialist and you control the state, then you have socialism. You have maybe some sort of deformed socialism, and I don't think there's anything that has nothing to do with socialism. Socialism has to have working class democracy, and if it doesn't, it's not socialism. And when the Soviet Union lost that democracy, it lost its socialism, and that, to my mind, that was well before Stalin took power. That was under Lenin, and that was under the war communism. I get it, but the working class democracy was lost in a very short period of time, and that's when socialism was largely come to an end, unless there was a revolution in Germany, say. So that's the first thing. And there are people who would defend, say, North Korea or China or Nicaragua and say, because there's some even sort of mistaken version of socialism, they should be defended on that basis. Well, they're not. They're just, in my mind, they're another version of capitalism. And there's a theory that these are be called state capitalist countries and things like that. But I think there are other exploitative systems that are running roughshod over their working classes. Now, if the U.S. was to invade Nicaragua or if the U.S. was to invade North Korea, then if Kim Jong-un or Ortega sets their army in opposition to the U.S. empire, then I'm not neutral on that question. Because if the Nicaraguan army holds them back or troubles the U.S. empire, then the U.S. empire is going to have a trouble going into Venezuela. In fact, I think you can make a statement that the difficulties they've had in the Middle East due to the Taliban, due to ISIS, all those difficulties are one of the reasons why the U.S. can't go into Venezuela right now.
Sure.
It's not the U.S. anti-war movement that stopped them.
Yeah, hell
We
no.
couldn't do. It's ISIS. It's Taliban. That's the ones who stopped them from going into Venezuela. And are the people in ISIS, Taliban, are those socialists who love Maduro? No, they want a caliphate or they want whatever. They are set against the U.S. empire for reasons of their own. And I don't agree with I don't have their ideology. I don't see them in any way producing the kind of movement that will ultimately be necessary to take capitalism down in a way that would make the world livable for them in their countries, let alone ours. But I support their struggle to challenge the U.S. empire when the U.S. empire is coming in to occupy that country. And I am not neutral on that question. I am not like, well, whoever kills who. It's like, no, I want the U.S. to lose, and I want the people who are being occupied to win in their resistance. And I'm not indifferent to it, but I would rather it be socialist. But if it's not, I'm not going to say, well, forget you then. Because it matters that when you stop the U.S. empire in their tracks in your region, because it keeps the U.S. empire from doing what it wanted to do, which is completely rewrite the whole place.
Yeah.
They said they wanted to bring Western democracy to the Middle East. That's not what they were planning on doing. They were bringing fire there. And the fact that they can't use the fire means now they want to light the fire and get out and leave it for Russia and Europe to deal with, while they take on China and set the world ablaze with a potential war with China. So the U.S. doesn't care. The U.S. only cares about one thing: victory. And victory does not mean anything good for workers here, or in Afghanistan, or China, or anywhere. So that is what I say about resistance. Is not it doesn't have to check socialism, nor do I say because you call yourself socialist do I check you off. It's whether or not the U.S. empire is coming into your room, and if you pick up guns to fight the U.S. empire, then I'm with you on that, because you're doing the right thing,
Even
if I don't agree with you. And I feel like we can see the results of the challenge the U.S. has faced in the Middle East, not from the anti-war movement, partially from other competitors, Russia and things like that. But a big part of it has been the resistance they faced on the ground, whether it was in Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan. And that resistance has made them have to think twice before they go into Venezuela. Had they been successful in the Middle East against those regions, in a heartbeat, they'd be bringing the troops into Venezuela because they were concerned about China and Russia coming in there. And this means they can get troops on the ground.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I remember listening to something along the lines of, when the Soviet Union fell, and there was no big enemy to fight, the U.S. started invading little countries. What was
Grenada.
it? Grenada, exactly. Just because they have to put their machinery to work.
Yeah.
And should display their power, and that's another reason why they have over 800 bases around the world now. Because there was no counterweight resistance.
But to be clear, I don't support the other empire. But if my country goes into your country and tries to take your country down, I'm with any of you who are in that country who are trying to fight against the U.S. If there's socialists in that country who back the U.S., I'm not with them. If they're non-socialists fighting the U.S. occupiers, I'm with them. Not with the socialists who happen to be, with the United States because they're going to bring some form of socialism as the United States comes in. Because it's Bernie Sanders, or whatever.
Where does China fall into this? I mean, are they...
China's an empire, right? In the sense they're building an empire. And
Russia.
And so is Russia. Russia's more militarily, a bit of a more military challenge, but I think China represents the empire that the United States is most concerned about. But it is not for me to be worried about that empire. My job is to take down this empire. And if any time I worry about that empire, I am strengthening the hand of my empire. Once I get into worried about what is China doing? What is China doing? Are they spreading? Are they doing this? Then I'm playing into the hands of my ruling class who wants me to be thinking about that so they can justify their wars with them. And so I have to say that's for the Chinese working class to take care of. And they're actually, there's more resistance in China among their working class than there is here. So my job is to build that resistance here. And to the extent that U.S. workers get all worked up about what's China doing, we're just playing the U.S. ruling class's game. How many haircuts do they get in North Korea?
I think like 17.
Exactly. Once you start thinking about how many haircuts they can get in North Korea and think that that's some sort of, then you know the ruling class in this country has you.
No, don't twist it, Andy. Don't twist it.
I mean, I see some of that. Yeah.
We have someone here twisting
I mean,
the words.
no,
Over
but
there we have someone blackmailing you.
That's right.
But I do think it's a valid point. I mean, it's, I do hear this, when I engage with people into talks about socialism and this stuff, they bring this stuff up real quick.
Well, let
They're
me
like,
give context to what I was saying. I was just saying that I was trying to compare how there are some slight there's room here to do some. There's less control, individual micromanaging as there is in North Korea, for example.
I understand. Yeah.
That's what that was coming from. We'll link the episode.
Yeah. There's like 6 episodes where you've talked about the haircuts in North Korea.
But yeah, ultimately, I think that it's important for us here, in the mothership of capitalism and empire, to build a revolution, because
Stick right into the belly.
we know that other countries that have attempted, even though they've failed for many reasons, even you can't build socialism from outside the U.S. I don't think it's you will get twisted and bent and forced into corners to make decisions, yeah, it has to start from here and it has to spread from here.
I mean, you would say you don't think there could be a social with it. You think the first revolution will have to be in the United States?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the big one has to start here.
I say that part I don't agree with. That part, I mean, certainly I would say I would love for that to be the way it happens. It would make it a lot easier for the globe. It makes it much more likely that international revolution could happen because the U.S. will be one of the biggest interferers in that revolution that happens in some other country. But I do think it's possible that if the working class is organized enough and is committed enough, in some other country, they could start it there. But it's a race against time, and they will have much less time than if the U.S. working class made a socialist revolution. There will be time. We will have a time if it doesn't spread. If we have a revolution in the United States and it doesn't spread, same thing. But we will have much more time to make that spread. The European capitalists, the Chinese, the Russians, all of them are going to come out against this if there was a revolution here. But we'll be in a better situation to defend ourselves and hold it off longer.
Yeah.
But I still believe that the capitalism is a global system. The chain could break anywhere. I mean, it does require something about the level of organization and consciousness of the working class. I could see it happening in a Latin American country or in a European country or even somewhere in Asia, and it being a kind of a beam of light as to what we're trying to do. But if we do not follow in their footsteps fairly quickly, then then the U.S. will be strangling that.
Mexico is an example.
How so?
Los zapatistas. They're doing their thing there, out in the jungle in Chiapas, and I think they're waiting, and they should get bigger, I think, but they're waiting for a collapse, and they're ready, I think, to some extent, whether you agree with it or not, Andy.
I mean, I do think it requires. I think the revolution will have to happen in the urban centers, it can't come from outside. I can understand how they can be a part of the peasant uprising that will be collaborating with such a revolution, but I don't think I don't think it will be an indigenous peasant movement of farmers that are going to be the springboard for socialist revolution in any country.
They're an army, Andy.
I don't think you can bring it in as from a military. It has to have working
Yeah.
class democracy.
Yeah.
We've already done that. We've done that in China. We did that in Nicaragua. We did it in Cuba. We did the whole bring the army in and
Yeah.
and it doesn't work. It
Yeah.
only produces a reform that is a failure, and that ultimately, in failing, produces this counter reaction.
Yeah. So I mean, I still, believe that it has
You
to
still
start from
believe
here.
my country's
Factor
the
of
best?
time.
Huh?
Yeah, Mexico. No, what? Not really. They're cracking down on Guatemalans.
Yeah. Oh.
That's not very nice. Let's talk about something else.
So,
Sorry, I interrupted you,
No.
Kenny. You were talking about something. So
No,
I was
just
playing.
reaffirming my point that I do believe it has to start here because of the factor of time and having the biggest military apparatus, and obviously it's not going to be a pretty fight here, but and it requires, obviously, we're very far from it. It requires the organization and the ability to strike when we have to for a prolonged time and yeah.
but I will say this: like, the Russian working class was small at the time when they had their socialist revolution, and the Russian economy was small. But when they had their socialist revolution, it did lead to changes that took place in Germany, and that was not a small working class. That isn't. So the Russian Revolution was a catalyst for the possibility of social changes, and the revolutionary period that Germany went through that pulled it out of the war, and that did nearly bring down the government. It didn't, and once it didn't, then it was game over. But it was a nearby country having its socialist revolution that acted as created the catalyst for the possibility of that revolution happening in an industrialized country. I could see something like that happening with us. I'm just saying that.
Come on, Canada. So.
Right, yeah. Or even Mexico, or even El Salvador. Again, I don't think the left in any of those countries is in any situation to make these things happen. Ecuador, there is a working class struggle taking down governments, and that's something, right? That's happening in Ecuador right now.
I mean, yeah.
But it's not a socialist movement.
Peasant, isn't it?
No, in
Indigenous
the cities.
in Quito.
Yeah, I mean, but there's movements in the cities of strikes that are taking place in Ecuador, right?
No, yeah, I mean, there's
Well,
a mass.
mostly I've only been informed of what's going on in Quito, and they had the leaders of the government move out of Quito, and they've now just conceded to something of the demands of the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and I agree that it has mostly that character, but I would say that unless it is, I do still believe that unless it is a working class movement, and the working class is mostly concentrated in cities, that it's not going to be able to challenge capitalism.
Yeah.
My. But I think one thing I'm always concerned about is if we're actually prepared. Like you have to be earthquake prepared for such a revolution. I think you need to be prepared.
Yeah.
Hospitals, you need to have working class people have actual already working groups working outside of
I do think that we have to be prepared in terms of the ideas and understanding what's happening, because the rest will take care of itself. Because again, I see moments of tragedy and disasters, and people come together, and there's these great acts. In Nicaragua, you could see that on the trenches, the barricades they formed. Students from the universities that were studying medicine, they were taking care of the wounded. And they figured it out on the fly. They weren't ready for a barricade, but they figured it out, and they were to a degree successful, except they didn't have the weapons, and they didn't want to use weapons. But people come together. They were feeding each other. There was this particular city in Nicaragua that was where the first revolution, or the revolution in the 80s took place. This time around, that was barricaded because that's where the resistance comes from. That's where a lot of the heart of revolutionary heart comes from. And these people were enclosed by the military, and they figure out ways to feed each other. The kids were in school, barricaded in universities, and our friends were we were smuggling food in there, or at least and people from here that were supporting the movement, sending money. So again, if the ideas are there, I think the rest will take care of itself. But I do think we are not ready in that sense. The ideas are very on the fringes right now. And
not even that. I think the idea of what real socialism is, because most people still associate it with just state control, or Nicaragua, or Cuba, or North Korea, or even China, or Bernie Sanders. I think the ideas of socialism are almost completely atomized, not just within this country, but globally. And where it will reconstitute itself to reclaim its true tradition, I'm not sure.
And that's why I think our job is to unmask these, people that claim that they're socialist democratic, or what does that even mean, and bring it to the forefront of conversations of everyday people. And
a
maybe
capitalist that pretends to be socialist.
Right? There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
We got some in our government right now, and he's running for president in the Democratic Party. So I'm not sure if there's anything else to.
It's been a very interesting conversation. I think that this will give us. I think we veered to other things like socialism in general, and I think that we will have these ongoing conversations, because as we think about what revolution means in the larger context, I think we can only speculate for now. And I think that when we talk about this to our public, because they wonder, well, what do you do outside of elections? What do you do or how am I supposed to have hope in a country, or how am I supposed to have any sense of a revolution in the future? These conversations are then there for them to listen to, and how we think about it. One thing I will never forget that I really got to me thinking was how, when we studied the Seattle general strike, how the strikes are really one element, one key instrument to be able to be used for to rising for the working class. And so when I talked about preparedness earlier, I meant organization to that extent, to take care of each other. And I think that if we think for the future how we want to have that, we have to start organizing wherever we are in our work sites. That's where it begins.
And strikes, GM is still on strike. Mack truck workers went on strike, and today I think Chicago teachers went on strike.
Almost 30,000 teachers.
So that's
educators, staff, everyone, right? I don't want to say just teachers.
So there are some things happening.
And so much for your somber.
I know what to say. I mean, it's those are good things. Those are good things happening.
Well, we have to get to a place where we can all do it together at the same time.
And how will people not be able to be fooled again and settle for things and stuff like that? I don't know how that's going to happen. We'll see.
Right.
Keep the candle lit.
Yes. Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Right, that does it for our episode. We will link episodes description, and please check us out on any of our 5 platforms, on Bitchute, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes Podcast, or YouTube. Please subscribe, rate, review, and best of all, share with your family, community, and friends. Check us out next week.
Oh, and if you have questions for Kenny, put them on there, and we'll force him to answer them.
What's your handle?
No, we'll be on the YouTube thing.
Put it on YouTube.
And he's going to answer it.
All right.
Maybe.
Maybe. You have to request me as a friend first. I want to have the ability to delete you.
You can. I love trolling with these people, so you can join me as a fellow troll.
It's fine.
Girls troll hunt. Yeah.
People give genuine questions. I respond genuinely, but then there's sometimes I'm trolls, and I don't respond to those. I mean, I do respond to those, but not in a friendly way.
Send them kisses.
You get off on these trolls, don't you?
I get a certain enjoyment.
All right.
See you next week.
Camera in the back. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, producer.
All right. Ciao.